the Whispering Lake, but no one believed me. The first night back, the lake whispered my name, and no one believed me. I had come to the town for the same shabby reasons people come home: to sort paperwork, to clear a house, to pretend some old corner of life could be folded away. But standing on the dock beneath the thin wash of street lamps, the sound wrapped itself around my bones, soft, patient, like a neighbor clearing their throat to say something private. I told myself it was wind, gulls, memory. I told Claire and she laughed. Lake's echo, not gossip. The second night, it said more. Words were loose, not whole sentences, syllables like shells that fit together wrong, so my mind stitched them into sense. Sometimes it sounded like my name folded in half, sometimes like the cadence of a childhood lullaby I had not heard in 20 years. I took a tape recorder down to the water, the heavy thing warm in my shaking hands, and left it on the rail while I returned in the morning expecting proof. The tape held only wind and the small, ordinary sounds of night. People in town offered reasonable reasons: swamp gas, old pipes, the gulls that nested in the reeds every spring. I showed recordings and watched faces skim the surface of curiosity, then slide back into habit. Claire brought coffee and a practical shrug. "You were always dramatic," she said with the kind of smile that shelters a refusal. The house itself seemed to hold its breath behind its drawn curtains, as if someone inside listened but refused to answer. I started to distrust my ears, and then my memory, because the lake kept speaking, as if keeping time with something only it remembered. Nights lengthened into a calendar of small betrayals. The whispers moved like a tide, faint at dusk and bolder near midnight, always circling, but never saying plainly what I wanted to know. Once, as fog sat like a shawl over the water, the voice threaded a single word I had not expected, a first name from a life I had tried to bury. It felt like a hand pressing an old photograph into my palm. The rational part of me catalogued possible explanations. The other part grew attentive the way a body does to a fever. On the sixth night, there were lights pearled, too slow to be boat lanterns, too deliberate to be stars. They skimmed the water and left reflections that moved wrong, as if the lake were showing me memories in a language it alone remembered. I saw a boat drifting close to the reeds with no one aboard, an oar tilted like a fossil. When I ran the length of the shore later, the moorings were neat and the boat gone, the rope taut, the post empty. I began to suspect the lake could choose what parts of the world would remain legible. Attempts to prove anything only widened the quiet between me and the town. I played back tapes for neighbors who shook their heads and said they heard nothing but the lake. Claire looked at me with a patience that had become an armor. "You don't need to bring the lake into the town's business," she told me once, as if the place itself might sulk if interrogated. That line lodged like a splinter. It was not that people were cruel. It was that they were busy with lives that required waters to remain indifferent. One morning, I found the rowboat at the waterline, half buried in reeds though the shore had been clear the night before. On its stern, initials were carved deep enough to catch shadow. A name I hadn't seen in years stared back at me in cramped, childish letters. I had never carved anything on that boat, never owned one. I lifted a pebble from the mud, and it hummed faintly against my palm, as if the stone had carried a phrase from under the water. It was the smallest proof, not loud, not sudden, and utterly impossible to explain away. I stopped trying to convince people after that. Convincing felt like giving the lake a map. Instead, I moved through nights with a new caution, listening for inflection and cadence the way a person might watch for a change of expression in someone they love. The lake's whispers grew more intimate, fragments of memory I had never shared aloud, confessions the dark must have kept. Once it echoed a lullaby my mother sang, but wrong. The tune skinned and the words slightly out of order. It felt less like hearing and more like recognition from something that had been watching me watch it. The climax arrived not with a scream, but with a question shaped like a door opening. The voice, patient, almost tender, folded my full name into the air and said, "We've been waiting." It was not a threat and not comfort. It was an announcement like the clock tolling a fate I'd been avoiding. I stepped off the dock because stepping felt less cowardly than staying. The water closed cool around my ankles, and for a moment, the world simplified into breathing and the whispering surface. I expected alarm, an upheaval of town and witnesses. Nothing except the sound of my name. The next morning, the town complained of nothing. The dock was as it had always been, the rowboat tethered neatly, as if left by ordinary hands. Claire stopped mentioning laughter. She laid a casserole on my porch and said, "Get some rest." I kept one pebble in my pocket, warm and impossibly wet, and sometimes at night I could still feel the trace of a syllable against my skin. People offered small kindnesses and practical questions, and I learned the shape of living with a secret everyone insists is only yours. I learned how stubborn a lake can be when it remembers.